Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining the third research webinar in our series this year. Just a special thanks from the trustees to all of you that have made a donation when registering for the webinar. Your support is greatly appreciated, and any of you who haven't made a donation and would like to do so, please go onto our website at the end of the webinar. Moving on, it's my great pleasure to introduce Gilly Davey, who's the founder and director of MS Get a Head Start, a consulting neurological physiotherapist and clinical lead for Active Plus Neurophysio here in Auckland. Gilly graduated in the UK in 2004, where she worked before moving to New Zealand and obtaining her postgraduate certificate in health and rehab science. Gilly then moved to the Advanced Rehab Centre in Sydney for 3.5 years, in which she started MS Get a Head Start. Gilly was proudly awarded the Australian Physiotherapy Association IPSM Special Commendation for achievement in neurological physiotherapy in 2015. In 2016, she was then awarded an honorary clinical fellowship for the Australian Catholic University. She returned to New Zealand in 2016 and ran her own successful company called Connect Neurophysio. Gilly closed that company at the end of 2021 and has taken up her role at Active Plus Neurophysio. Gilly has spoken at a number of MS events up and down the country. And Gilly, we greatly appreciate, one, your enthusiasm and your support for this webinar tonight. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and obviously it's always an absolute pleasure and honour to be here. So as I mentioned, always an absolute honour to have this privilege of talking to people about what I'm very passionate about, which is obviously exercise, being a neurological physio. But today's talk is really honing in on some of the latest research, and in particular one quite pioneering study that is really going to change the exercise delivery regarding volume and intensity for MS moving forwards. And it's one of our first really kind of evidence-based and expert opinion clinical guidelines that have been released recently. So that's what the scope of this talk's going to be about. It's only about 30 minutes, and I'll do well to keep it to 30 minutes, because if anyone knows me, I do tend to get a little bit passionate about talking a lot. So there is a lot about MS and exercise that won't be covered in this talk, but as I say, I'm going to try and get through some really interesting parts. So as a fabulous introduction by Neil, so I don't need to tell you much more about myself, but as I say, currently working for Active Plus in, up here in Auckland, and this was me and my team and some of our members of our MS group class the other day for MS World MS Day with our balloons. As mentioned, I'm the founder of MS Get a Head Start, and I'm also a clinical advisor for the fabulous Rex Bionics, which is the we've got access to one of the only exoskeletons here in New Zealand, and we do use that quite a bit with our MS population, so I can talk about that a little later. But to get going, what today is actually going to cover is, what are now the current physical activities and exercise guidelines for those people living with MS, and also a little bit about how we should be implementing them. So, not to scare everyone off who is potentially sitting there and knowing that exercise isn't the most easiest things to do, but we are at a point now where there's enough evidence to research to show us that exercise really is quite non-negotiable for MS and the management of MS. And I say, however, I know for a bunch of you, that is something that instantly you're going to go, oh my God, how on earth can I MS when I'm so fatigued already, or I've already got quite a lot of limited movement, what can I possibly do? So a couple of there's two kind of key things that really will challenge the way you can exercise with MS. And first of all, that is fatigue. And the next one is heat sensitivity. So I just thought I'd just front foot this webinar just with briefly going over a couple of the issues that arise when we exercise and you have MS, and some of the things that often put people off exercising. Because the reality is, at the moment, we still have 80% of individuals living with MS that fall well below the recommended physical activity guidelines by the World Health Organization. So that's 80% are currently well below the recommendation. So, as I mentioned, we've got fatigue and heat sensitivity. So fatigue is one of the most reported symptoms for MS. However, what a lot of people don't often understand is that there's different types of fatigue. And also the human body is quite interesting, and that the brain doesn't necessarily know the difference between physical fatigue and cognitive fatigue. So an example of this is that, you get up, you go to work, and you'd sit down to have breakfast, you sit in the car to get to work, you might sit down at work for 8 hours, sit down in the car to come home, sit down to have dinner, and you're exhausted. Now, what we know is that exhaustion, if you've not physically moved your body, is a cognitive fatigue. And they do reckon that those who have MS, that your brain could be working up to 50% harder, even just at rest, than someone without MS. So first of all, it's really hard when you feel awful and you feel extremely exhausted, and you have someone like me saying that exercise is great. And as I say, it takes quite a while to really, as I say, understand and appreciate that a good majority of the fatigue that you are feeling with MS is cognitive fatigue. It is neural speed fatigue. And actually, exercise is going to improve that fatigue. And as I say, for a lot of people, this sounds like a complete contradiction to how they feel, but I can assure you that there is a lot of research, and Paluti study 2013, and I'll just make a comment, more than happy to share my slides on to go along with the recording as well. So the full list of references is there. I did a randomized control trial and a systematic review of the randomized control trials to show that exercise does actually improve fatigue rather than make it worse. So, it is something to just to start that ball rolling, that even though you may feel exhausted, is that actually exercise can be beneficial because it's likely to be cognitive fatigue. And then our real big problem when we exercise with MS is that we can get a whole range of really not very nice symptoms that make you think that exercise might be making you worse. And that is this heat sensitivity. And what it is called is an exercise-induced symptom exacerbation. So what we're looking at here is that your MS has not got worse, but the symptoms you have can be exacerbated because of the heat. So we only need a 0.5 degree heat change in your body for your nerve conduction speed to slow down. So when we exercise, it is normal that you get warmer, your core temperature raises because you're moving your body. And what the research has found out is that individuals living with MS, due to potentially plaques around your hypothalamus, which is your temperature controlling part of your brain, is that you don't react too well to that heat increase. You don't effectively cool down. So our initial way to cool down is the sweat, and it's the evaporation of the sweat off our skin, which helps us cool down. Now in MS, what they've seen is that efficiency to manage the heat isn't very good. So what happens is the internal core temperature starts to rise as you're exercising, and your nerve speed slows down. So what you then often get is this exacerbation of symptoms, and it's often quite sensory orientated. So it will be things like double vision, your balance will feel wobbly, you might have numbness, you might get some pain, you might get some weakness. And you can imagine if you're exercising and you've recently been told you've got this neurological condition called MS, and you get all of these symptoms that come up when you exercise, it's a really quick thing to put people off exercise. So it's really vital that, as I say, people in my role as health professionals really spend the time educating individuals living with MS that this is normal. It's just a heat response. Oh, sorry, excuse me. I've just got a printer printer updating itself behind me. I just cancelled that. It was a bit noisy. So that it's a temporary. So as soon as your temperature cools down, so as soon as you stop exercising and cool that temperature down, those symptoms are going to drop back down again. So as again, I can absolutely reassure you, there is no permanent damage and you are not making your MS worse. All it is a temporary exacerbation while you're hot. And as soon as you cool down, that will be better. So there's a lot of research out now about how is effective ways of cooling, exercising with MS. And my number one thing to recommend is absolutely ice cold water. So not even colder than what you see in that picture there. We're talking about an ice slushy. So some ice cubes in a blender, blend it up and sip on that before you exercise, during exercise and after, because consuming that ice cold liquid straight down into your core is what's going to really help drop that core temperature quickly. So we call it proactive cooling. And there's also other mechanisms that we use, which is about interval training, okay, because again, really short intervals allow us to heat up, but then cool down. So as I say, this in itself, fatigue management and heat management, is a good hour topic itself. So I'm not going to spend any more time on it now, but what I want to just reassure anyone is that the fatigue often you feel is cognitive based, and exercise can improve that. And that it is normal when you have MS to have some form of symptom exacerbation when you exercise. And it's important that you work with a health professional to work out how to best manage that. Because also we don't want you losing your balance or tripping or falling or hurting yourself. So when it comes to exercise and MS, this is the bit I'm really going to skip over, because again, this could be a whole day's worth of talks, is that there is absolutely substantial evidence that has been around for the last 30 years. And we can see some really lovely research here, which is looking at meta-analysis, systematic controls, so systematic trials, that show that exercise can significantly benefit MS. And that's been shown for mobility, for balance, okay, for cognition, for general quality of life, for reducing falls, for improving fatigue, as well as things like improving cardiac function, bone density, weight management. So, and all of this has been well proven within an MS population. So, the thing I really want you to take from here is that wherever you are on your journey with your MS, is that exercise can have a really beneficial effect, and that's been well proven. Because we, as I mentioned at the start of this talk, we do have this real problem, unfortunately, with the MS population, is this inactivity levels. At 80% of individuals living with MS are well below the recommended activity levels. And what we've got here is a little infographic that I grabbed off the internet last week, is actually those risks associated with sedentary lifestyle, so, and often referred to now as a sitting disease. And I won't read them out because you can see them all there, but basically what we've got in societies now is the society is the most inactive we have ever been as a human population. And we evolved thousands of years ago to be very mobile, be walking marathon distances a day, finding our food, using all our limbs and our muscles and our joints and our bones. And it's only really over the last 50 years, and especially in the last 30 years with the technology revolution, that we have become so sedentary. And if you see, there's a lot of on that items on that list, that if you've already got MS, you don't really want to get any of those on top, okay? Having an increased inflammation, having an immune system affected due to more dysfunction, losing muscle mass and strength, it's a bit of a double whammy. So we really need to ensure that everyone with MS has been as active as possible. And also really excitingly is where the research is starting to move in the MS population is around exercise having a disease modifying effect. So we're not saying that exercise can stop the disease progression, but we have seen that with exercise, it is having a very positive effect on reducing relapse rate, okay, reducing disease activity, okay, and helping to actually activate and reactivate the body to remyelinate. Now, these studies that are coming out are in the preliminary because to measure brain activity and degeneration is fairly in-depth scanning involved, and it's something that the physical, exercise world is just starting to jump on, really over the last 5 years. So it's quite a lot of new evidence. So we don't have really hard evidence, but there's a lot of studies that are pointing to the fact that exercise has a disease-modifying effect. And there's a big group of really well-known researchers around the world who have got together to really make sure that over the next 5 years, there's going to be some really much more substantial evidence and research done on exactly what does happen regarding remyelination and the effects of exercise on that disease-modifying effect. So it's really exciting times. So when it comes to exercise prescription, so a lot of people often say, what do I actually need to be doing for exercise for MS? So back in 2013, we had this research paper published by Latimer Chung, and this was our first kind of evidence-informed physical activity guidelines. Now, the tricky part about this was that it was obviously a great great piece of research to start the ball rolling. However, what we know regarding MS as a condition, it is so highly individual, and that disease trajectory is so variable that these guidelines only really worked for individuals who are in that kind of no impairment to mild impairment. So I'll talk a little bit about the expanded disability symptom scale, the EDSS score, in a moment, but that kind of 0 to 4, which meant there was a huge amount of the MS population who still didn't really have any recommendations. And part of this, unfortunately, is because to that point in 2013 and even today, a lot of the research has been done in the mild to moderately impaired, and not much research has been done in the newly diagnosed and very minimally impaired, and the more advanced who may be more confined to wheelchair or limited mobility. So we've kind of got, this whole disease spectrum and still not necessarily that great guidelines. So very excitingly, kind of in the middle of when COVID was kicking around the world, was the release of this study in 2020 by Caleb and his big crew. And there's a lot of key MS researchers. So Robert Mottle, Ulrich Douglas, and we've got Herb Kapatkin and Lara Paluti. These are some really big names in the MS exercise research world. So it's a very much of a collaborative study. And this is the first set of exercise-based guidelines, or exercise and lifestyle physical guidelines, which actually recommend what you should be doing from newly diagnosed, no impairments, right through to end, kind of bedbound, someone who's very severely affected. Now, before I get anyone concerned about that trajectory, please remember that not everyone is on that trajectory. Some people stay in the mild category for all of their life, and some people do, unfortunately degenerate. So don't presume when I say, from one end to the other, that everyone's going to go that way. But this has been a real game changer in prescription of exercise, and actually now as health professionals give us something really valuable to use as a platform. So this is what this talk is going to base on today, because it breaks down what you should be doing for each part of that trajectory. So some key recommendations that this paper delivers is that healthcare providers should endorse and promote benefits in the safety of exercise and lifestyle physical activity for every person with MS. Now, I think in New Zealand, we're very, and those who are joining us from Australia, that we are quite an active population, but I do believe that every healthcare provider could do more, at making sure that, those living with MS are really able to access and have the expert info about how to exercise for them. Early evaluation by a physical occupational therapist or an exercise or sports science is someone experienced in MS. And this is, again, a bit of a tricky part, that MS, is a condition that not all, physios and not all, personal trainers are that familiar with. So having an individualized program, because again, MS is so individualized, by someone who is an expert, okay, or at least got experience, but also that early evaluation. What we often find in our field is a lot of people don't come to us until they have a problem. And we want to actually start with you before physical problems arise. Obviously, when designing an exercise program for an individual, we need to take into account what we call comorbidity. So that's pre-existing things. You might have an arthritic knee, you might have chronic low back pain, you might have asthma. You know, there's a lot of things as a health professional that may change what your exercise prescription will look like individually for you, as well as symptom fluctuations. So as I mentioned before, we have a large percentage of individuals living with MS who are very heat sensitive and have a lot of cognitive fatigue. So the way that we're going to deliver exercise for someone who's very heat sensitive is going to be different to someone who has no heat sensitivity. Okay, but no matter what, the recommendations are 150 minutes of exercise and or 150 minutes of lifestyle physical activity a week. So basically 300 minutes a week of moving the body is the recommended guideline, no matter where you are on that trajectory. Progress towards these targets should be gradual. Okay, so I think, again, a lot of people get put off by exercise because they'll go and do too much too quickly, and then basically either get that symptom exacerbation or wear themselves out and just put themselves off. So it's really important that we have this gradual increase to help keep you confident, avoid injuries, and bring you up to a standard gradually. Okay, and we often need these regular repeats and referrals. And I think, again, this is something that our healthcare system isn't quite at yet, is that as soon as you know there is a change in your physical ability, that there is a referral back to a specialist and back to someone who's got exercise experience to alter your prescription of exercise. Okay, and when this is a really key one, that when your mobility is very limited, exercise needs to be facilitated by a trained assistant. So the reality is that when you are very limited in your physical ability, so, you know, very limited mobility from a wheelchair or even bedbound, is you need someone to help exercise with you. You need someone to help you redo these. Now, I know a few of you are already going, oh, but I don't have access to someone yet. Bear with me, because I'm going to talk a little bit about that implementation in a few more slides. Now, this is where it gets a little shocking, okay? So please no one get too upset to start with. So as I say, this whole research program has been, research document has been delivered on the EDSS score. Now, this is how your neurologist will be grading where your MS is, and this is what Pharmac is using regarding access to some of your medications as well. So most of you will be familiar with this. So your 0 to 4.5, so that is someone with no impairment, right up to someone who can walk 300 meters with or without an aid. So that's quite a big variation. So that's someone who could still be running marathons, down to someone who's limited to 300 meters with a stick, okay, or a frame, let's say. So there's a lot of numbers on the screen. Now, this is what I'm presenting for each of these, is what is the recommended gold standard that we should be trying to get you to. Now, as I say, if you are nowhere near this at the moment, don't panic, because remember, it's a build effect. So aerobic, so this is looking at 40 to 60% predicted heart rate max. So this is where you are breathing a little bit heavier, but you can still talk you can still talk, okay? You're not gasping for breath. And you should be hitting around this heart rate zone for about 10 to 30 minutes, 3 times a week. We've then got advanced aerobic, so that's 70 to 80, where you're breathing hard enough that you're not going to have a conversation, okay? You're actually really focused on your breathing. And this could be up to 40 minutes, 5 times a week. Now, that's not 40 minutes as 5 lots of 40. That could be 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, 2 minutes here. But they recommend that 5 times a week, you are getting really quite out of breath, okay? And then this is the really new part of the research, okay, is this high intensity interval training that once a week you need to get absolutely to your maximum, okay, that you can hardly get that breath in. You're getting 90 to 100% of your predicted heart rate max, but you're looking at 30 seconds, okay, so 5 lots of 30 seconds once a week, okay. Then we need to be doing strength training, okay, 2 to 3 times a week, and they recommend anywhere between 5 to 10 exercises for strength training. Flexibility, okay, so some key muscles to be stretching, things like your calf muscle to help with your walking, needs to be done every day, okay. And then the neuromotor is referring to if you've got an impairment that needs some specific input, okay? So that could be your balance, it could be gait training, it could be your left hand dexterity, for example, that if you want to specifically work on getting an impairment better, that is 20 to 60 minutes, 3 to 6 times a week. Okay, that neuromotor can also include things like Tai Chi, okay, and kind of, you know, some of more of those exercise group classes. So I know there's going to be a huge amount of you who are going, oh my God, that is a ridiculous amount of exercise. There's a huge amount of the population who don't have MS, who I can guarantee you are not that active. But what you need to take from this is the current evidence of gold standard, okay, of how exercise can significantly help your MS. So rather than looking at it and panicking, think about where you can start gradually increasing your exercise, because if you can be meeting this gold standard, then you are going to be in the most optimal position you possibly can be to be living well and managing that MS from a physical body point of view. So then moving on, so if into the next category, so this our 5.0 to 6.5. So this is taking someone from who can't quite walk that 300 meters with an aid down to someone who can only walk 20 meters. Okay, so someone who is between 20 meters with whatever aid is needed up to about 300 meters. And what you'll see from here is, fortunately or unfortunately, it doesn't change that much. The only thing that has changed on this whole prescription between this next level up is that aerobic maximum is at 10 to 30 minutes, whereas before it was a little bit less. So, you know, it's just basically, again, saying that we need to make sure that we're trying to hit these milestones, okay? Then as we go into the next level, so this is real kind of diminished ability to perform ADLs and non-ambulatory. So this is someone who is able to maybe stand and transfer by themselves, might be able to take an odd step, but really they're spending the majority of their time in a wheelchair. And this is where we start to see quite a change. Now, as I say, this is some of the first research that has been published actually as a guideline for these more advanced cases of MS. And what you'll see is there's a different order now. So one of the most important things that they've established with the evidence is breathing exercises. And I know that I've done some of this work with some of my MS clients, but it's definitely not something that is gold standard with physio prescription yet. So if you can go and ask your physio and exercise trainer for some breathing exercises and something that's either using a spirometer or a resisted inhaler, that's going to be really beneficial. So we're looking at very simple 3 sets of 10, 4 times a week, but being significantly shown to help keep that lung capacity. They've broken this down into upper extremities and lower extremities, because obviously for some individuals, moving the upper or lower limb can be more impaired at this level. But with the upper extremities, they're still recommending that you're doing something like 6 lots of 3 minutes at that 70% of your predicted heart rate max, 3 to 7 times a week. So that will be something like an arm cycle, okay, or boxing. So that's still looking at getting those arms moving 3 to 7 times a week to get that heart rate up, as well as some strength exercises. So they've said something like either 3 reps of 10 or 10 reps of free. So that means it's only doing it 3 times, have a rest, and then 10, because we know that neuromuscular fatigue can kick in a lot more as we're going up this EDSS score. Then we get to the lower extremities, and this is some really interesting evidence for those who might need some evidence to help get hold of things like standing frames, etc., from Ministry of Health, that you should be standing for 30 minutes. Sorry, excuse me. Oh, excuse me, frog in my throat. Oh, there we go. That you should be standing for 30 minutes 3 times a week, minimum, as well as 30 to 60 minutes of walking and cycling. And what they define in the evidence here, because obviously this is someone who can't walk, this is on treadmill training. So body weight support, okay, or a cross trainer. So actually assisted, devices to get you up and moving, or cycling. So for some of you where you can't move your legs, it's looking at access and equipment that can move your legs for you, as well as some strengthening. They reckon, again, the flexibility, some stretches should be daily, but also they've got this little set of core exercises, which is working on the posture. So if you look there, you're looking at working on your sitting balance every day, and every 1 to 2 hours, some posture exercises. So I can tell you now, even from my clinical experience, is we're not prescribing this volume yet for individuals at this level of disability. And we need to be, because this is what the evidence is saying is going to make a difference to their lifestyle and their quality of life and their function. We then go into our next level. So we've got really very confined to a wheelchair now, and probably transferred with full assistance, so some form of hoist, okay, and unlikely to be able to stand, okay, by themselves. So again, we've got the breathing exercises. There's still this recommendation of some aerobics, so again, arm bike or some boxing, and even whether that's only one arm, if one arm's more affected. Carrying on with the strength exercises 3 times a week. Again, this is now saying standing 30 minutes every day, and if able to stand themselves, 1 to 2 minutes, okay, several times a day, so 2 to 3 times a day. It's still carrying on with that sitting balance, okay, as well as that core exercises every 1 to 2 hours, doing some postural exercises. And then right to our level 9. So unfortunately, this is someone who is essentially bed bound. Okay, so even getting up into a chair is very limited. So still breathing exercises 4 times a week, passive range of movement and active as possible. So this will need to be fully assisted by someone. And then they have a strong recommendation in this population for our electrical stimulation. So that's what the FES stands for, functional electrical stimulation, looking to maintain range of movement, maintain muscle mass and circulation. So as I say, so for quite a few of you, you're going to be completely terrified by all of this exercise. But as I say, remember, this is a starting point of where, as a profession and as a population, we are trying to move forwards in managing MS as proactively as we can, especially if exercise is going to have this disease modifying effect. So the challenging part also is an inconsistency of information. I know a lot of you out there are going to have done a bunch of Googling, you've got to have looked at exercise and MS, and you would have found everything from someone saying don't do it to someone saying doing huge amounts. So there has been a study, there has been a study done in 2021, so only last year, by Sadi Bahami, who looked at actually the quality of information out there about exercise for MS on the web, on some quite legitimate resources, and the stats were pretty shocking. That basically, out of the 27 web pages that they looked at, there was at least 18 key points that didn't meet the recommendations. So we do have to be a little bit careful when looking about what are we looking at. Is it actually giving you the latest evidence-based research? And what I have presented you today is that study by Caleb. It is a freely available open journal, so you can go and Google that. As I say, it's in my reference list, and we can pop it as an attachment with the video recording on the MS Trust website, that you can access that yourself. And I think it's really important to understand that that is where we are at the moment. So research into action. So, this is a tricky part, because what we do know in the professional medical world is that it can take somewhere between 15 to 17 years from published research to become day-to-day practice. And that's too long. Okay, so what we know is that we need to now be trying to put this research that was published 2 years ago into more day-to-day practice. So first of all, what we know is that exercise must be promoted at diagnosis. No matter if you are unimpaired and have no symptoms, we need to be trying to make sure that you're hitting that number one, table that I showed of really promoting exercise in your lifestyle. Exercise training programs should be prescribed and delivered by a qualified exercise professional, because as you can see, there is a different demand of what is needed depending on where you are in the trajectory, as well as what your own comorbidities are, and as well as what your MS is, and more importantly, what your goals are and what your function is, and how are we going to help keep you functioning or get you better. Exercise programs need to be reviewed, progressed and altered. So if you've been provided a program, it really needs to be reviewed probably at least a minimum of every 3 months. Okay, every 3 to 6 months. Okay, you need to have that program reviewed, because I'd expect that you'd be getting better and you can have a tweak and a change. Okay, so just being provided a set of exercises 4 years ago from your physio isn't going to cut the mustard. And what's really important from this evidence is that we need assistance, to help you exercise pretty much from EDSS 7 onwards. Now, some of you are going, oh, how does that happen? And I'll come there in a sec. And also what this research shows is that you actually do need access to specialist equipment, okay? And that's needed from EDSS 5 onwards. So we're talking standing frames, body weight support treadmill, things like exoskeletons, arm cycles, actually access to this stuff is needed. So a lot of you are going to say, well, I don't have access. And I suppose this is where we've all got to join together and now start really pushing this research into Ministry of Health, into our neurologists, into our GPs, into our local MS societies, into our local gyms, that, if we're going to have a population living well with MS, we need to make these things available. And as I say, I can help deliver where the research is, but as a collective, we've all got to band together to see if we can fundraise and get an arm crank into a local gym that multiple people can access. Okay, we really need to be looking at, at this review of the funding models and the access to exercise with MS, because it's not equal. We know that, and it's not equal depending on where you live in the country or what you can access, and it should be better. So now that we've got some hard guidelines with strong recommendations, that's what I want you to be able to take to people and say, this is what I deserve. So to achieve substantial change in your physical activity, adherence to a multimodal approach, so we do need to also work on behaviour change techniques, education and person-centred rehab. You don't move from, not exercising at all to suddenly hitting all of those gold standard points overnight. Okay, like it is hard, and you're going to need a lot of support to do that. And that is me. So thank you very much. So the take-home message from today: exercise and physical activity have positive, powerful impacts on your quality of life. And what we can see from the latest research is that we all need to be doing more, but you really need an expert to help take you along those lines. So I will finish there. As I say, I'm going to help, provide these slides for you guys to access as well, because I went through quite a lot of information there. And as I say, there is a full list of references available. But I will close this down and let any questions come my way.
Thank you, Gilly. We've got at least one question at this stage. And that's to say, your EDS 5.5 to 6 repeats with a saying as up to 4.5. Your comments suggest that the former is incorrect.
Well, now, let me go.
Can
That might have been...
clarify that?
Yeah, that might have been my comment. And as I said that, I think I was one ahead of myself. Yes, they are correct, whoever picked that up. Sorry, that was my mistake between the two. So the pretty much the requirements from your 0.5, your 0 to your 4.5 and your 5 to your 6.5 are pretty much exactly the same.
Thank you. Would you like to just clarify what you think the ministry should be providing in the way of equipment for people at home as standard, and just clarify what you're aware of the ministry will fund, because that will give people an indication as to what they should be asking their NASC for. Yeah,
I believe if you are on that EDSS score of, you know, your 7.58 upwards, i.e. you have very limited mobility, you are spending the majority of your time in a wheelchair and you need assistance to transfer, you should have a standing frame at home, because we know that standing frames are going to be really impactful for not just keeping you upright, but they are good for breathing. They're good for bladder and bowel maintenance, helping reduce things like UTIs. They're good for managing your range of movement, okay, bone density, contractures, okay. It's really important. And I know the Ministry of Health are always limited on their funding ability, but however, I have understood recently with a standing frame application that if you have a condition that is deemed to not improve, that your condition or your current presentation is long-term, and when they're saying long-term, they're looking at 5-10 years plus, then you do meet that criteria for a standing frame. If you were someone, let's say, who had a spinal cord injury and you're only 6 months post-spinal cord injury, who they view might get a bit better, then they're holding back from those standing frames. Okay, so I would say for someone who is at home, who is EDS of 7.5 to 8 upwards, I believe the Ministry of Health should be providing a standing frame for home. Okay, and I do believe some form of access to some exercise equipment. Now, as I say, whether that is something like arm cycles where you can get little pedal systems and stuff at home, but I think we really need to make sure that there is accessible gym spaces for people to exercise with. And I think that's something from our current Ministry of Health, is that, you might be able to go as an outpatient to a local hospital clinic, local hospital gym, but for something like 6 weeks, and then that's it. So, I do feel that if the hospital isn't able to provide the equipment, then really the Ministry of Health should be really investing in the primary care model, so that there is, either council-run gyms or, accessible gyms that aren't too costly, that do have some appropriate equipment for people living with disabilities.
Thank you. The next question, do the exercise guidelines change as we age, i.e. are they different for a 65-year-old as opposed to a 20-year-old?
No, they don't. And that's a great question. And it is the what's different is when it said predicted heart rate max. So if you were 20, you're a fit 20-year-old, then we're going to be, really pushing you hard for your heart rate. And now if you were 65, we're still going to be pushing you really hard, but your heart rate max is going to be lower. But regarding the exercise volume, okay, so how many times a week and how many minutes you should be doing, that does not change if you are 20 or 99. Okay, if you are physically up and moving, if you want to stay physically up and moving, so especially that 0 to 6 on the EDSS, you need to be exercising that amount no matter your age.
Thank you. The next one was, sorry. I think. Oh, Gilly, do you feel your neurophysio colleagues across Auckland and the rest of New Zealand are across these standards to aim for?
I'm probably going to say not necessarily, because this is a paper that, as I say, though it was released 2 years ago, 2020, when it comes for physios necessarily staying up to date, as I say, it can take 10 to 15 years for research to come into practice. So it is a standard that all neurophysios should be at. So if you are currently working with a physio, a personal trainer, an exercise physiologist who isn't aware of the standard, I would strongly recommend you to give them a copy. They give them the link. It's freely available, because I can guarantee anyone who is a trained health professional, if they read this latest paper, it will definitely change their practice, because they will realize this is obviously a very evidence-based, our brand new clinical guidelines. But sometimes, there is unfortunately or fortunately thousands of papers published every year on MS. So it's not always guaranteed that the therapist you're working with would have got this latest one. But as I say, this is one of the reasons why Neil and MS Research Trust kindly asked me to present, was so that both those who are there on this call webinar living with MS can spread the word. But I do know we've also got a bunch of health professionals also access in this webinar. So it's a great resource for me to help share that this new guideline is there. I can absolutely guarantee that your neurologists and your GPs will not know about it. So it will be a great one to take to them as well.
Thank you, Gilly. That's the end of the questions. I just want to say to you once again, a hugely stimulating and challenging talk. Even for those of us that don't have MS, I can see some exercises there that we should all be doing. So thank you once again, and the appreciation from all of us here at the Research Trust for your time and effort in putting this together. Thank you. Ask if I can introduce Dr. Wolfgang Marx. Firstly, to once again express his regret that he wasn't able to do this live. But Dr. Marx is a postdoctoral research fellow and head of the nutraceutical research stream at the Food and Mood Centre in Queensland. He's an accredited practicing dietitian and received his PhD from the Bond University, where he investigated the use of a ginger-derived polyphenol for chemotherapy-induced nausea and fatigue. This presentation has been pre-recorded as he's currently overseas presenting on his research. However, he's kindly agreed to answer any questions that we following the webinar. So if you have a question, either log it on this webinar or email it after the presentation to info@msresearch.org.nz.
Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Wolfgang Marx from Deakin's Food and Mood Centre, and while unfortunately I'm not able to speak to you live today, I do want to say it is an absolute pleasure to speak to you today about the exciting new research around the role of our gut microbiota in multiple sclerosis. And so today I wanted to provide a primer on the gut-brain axis, what it is, what do we know about it, what we currently know about the link between our guts and multiple sclerosis. And then I wanted to discuss some of the ways diet and dietary supplements are being researched as a way to intervene in our gut microbiome and what this means for the interventions that we use for multiple sclerosis. So generally when we speak about gut bugs, our mind would think about, a gut infection or an upset stomach. But due to advances in our ability to analyze the bacteria and the environment within our gut, We now know that there's a whole essentially zoo of various bacteria in our gut, and that these bacteria may interact with almost every system within our body, every organ, and has been investigated for a whole host of different chronic diseases, including multiple sclerosis. The gut microbiota consists of tens of trillions of microorganisms. Now, the best studied microorganisms within the gut are our bacteria, but there are also a whole host of different types of microorganisms, things like viruses, parasites, yeasts, that we're also just now learning that they might be implicated in a whole host of various diseases and conditions as well. There are over 1,000 different species of known bacteria that live within our gut microbiota, and the gut microbiota cells account for roughly 50% of our total cell count, which means that only roughly 50% of the cells that make up us are human cells, and the rest are belonging to the bacteria and the organisms that belong within our gut microbiota, which is quite a wild number. I also wanted to show this image that I thought was quite interesting. So this is essentially like a cross-sectional snapshot of our gut microbiome. On the left, with those kind of hundreds and thousands looking lines, they are the various microorganisms within our gut microbiome. The green dividing layer is the mucus layer that protects, I guess, our cell wall from the environment within our gut microbiome and our human cells. And the blue lines and on the right, bottom right hand side depicts our human colon cells. So now that we know a little bit about what the gut microbiome is, what do we mean by the gut-brain axis? Well, this is essentially a term that we use to describe the bidirectional communication between our gut and our brain. So essentially how our gut talks to our brain and how our brain talks to our gut. And there are a few ways that we think the gut is able to communicate with our brain, and this is through various systems like through various metabolites. Our gut can produce neurotransmitters such as serotonin. Actually, a large proportion of the serotonin that's produced within our body is actually produced in our gut, which was quite wild. And also through the vagus nerve, which is a nerve that runs from our brain to our GI system. And essentially this connection between our gut and our brain is now being studied for a wide variety of different brain-related conditions, things such as stroke, mental illness, and of course neurodegenerative disorders such as multiple sclerosis. So let's talk about that. What do we currently know about the gut-brain axis? So there are a few ways that researchers can go about trying to answer this question. And the first one that I'll mention is that they go about by measuring the gut microbiome of people with MS and then comparing this gut microbiome composition to people without MS. And indeed, there's been a number of different studies that have done just that. And so when they do this, they see a number of differences in a range of different bacteria, as I've put up here on this slide. And so I guess this provides a signal that the gut microbiome might be relevant to MS. But there are a range of things that might skew this result. So for example, do the medications that people with MS influence the gut microbiota? And perhaps this is explaining some of the differences that we're seeing between people with MS and people without MS. It also doesn't quite answer the causality of this difference. So essentially what I mean by that is any difference in the gut microbiota actually driving MS, or is it simply associated or the result from this disease? And so I guess this provides an interesting starting point, but we need to sort of look further to get a better understanding of how and what this difference actually means. One key way of teasing apart the role of the gut microbiome, not only in MS, but for microbiome research as a whole, has really been through the use of germ-free mice. So these are essentially mice that do not have an intact microbiome. And when researchers have compared these mice to mice with a microbiome, they see this really diverse range of differences in all sorts of important processes related to brain function. So this includes the modulation of key neurotransmitters, things like serotonin or BDNF, changes in neurogenesis, and I guess the blood-brain barrier, which I guess as the name suggests is that barrier that protects our brain. But also highly relevant to MS are changes in myelination. Another highly influential study design has been through the use of gut microbiome transplants. So this is where researchers have taken the gut microbiome samples of people with MS, as well as samples from people without MS, and they have transplanted these samples into a mouse model of MS. And when they do this, they see that the mice that receive the sample from people with MS start to exhibit worse symptoms and a greater incidence of MS-like conditions. And this is compared to the mice that received a sample from people without MS. And so I think this is a really elegant study design because it provides quite compelling evidence to suggest that those changes that we see in the gut of people with MS aren't simply associations, but that these changes might be important drivers for the onset and the progression of multiple sclerosis. So now that we understand that the gut microbiome might be implicated in, I guess, various aspects of multiple sclerosis, what is the research saying about how we can intervene in this process? How can we modulate the gut microbiome to improve MS outcomes? There are a wide variety of interventions that are being trialed right now. Things like fecal microbiota transplant has been in the news, but I wanted to focus on the role of various diet-related interventions, and this includes prebiotics, probiotics, and fermented foods. And the reason why I wanted to focus more on the diet-related interventions is because we know now that there are a whole host of things that can influence our microbiome. You know, how we're born, our age, medications that we take, but diet is one of the key, if not the key driver for changes in our gut microbiome. Let's first talk about prebiotics, and I guess a good starting point is, what are they? So they are defined as a substrate that is selectively utilized by host microorganisms conferring a health benefit, which is a great definition for researchers, but doesn't really give us very much clarity about what they actually are. So let's try and break this down a little bit. So when we first eat food, any meal, let's say we're having lunch, our body breaks down this food through the gastrointestinal tract. Now this process allows our gut bacteria to access various prebiotic compounds within our diet. And examples of these include dietary fiber, which is a widely studied prebiotic, but there are also all sorts of other compounds that have prebiotic properties, things like polyphenols, which are present in fruits, vegetables, spices, teas, extra virgin olive oil. Why blueberries are blue are because of the polyphenol content in these sorts of foods, but also polyunsaturated fatty acids such as omega-3 fatty acids all have prebiotic properties. Now, our gut bacteria love to essentially eat these prebiotic compounds, and they use that as a fuel source. And so by doing this, and as part of this process, this results in the growth of these healthy bacteria, but it also increases certain metabolites, such as short-chain fatty acids, that we think might be beneficial to a whole host of conditions, including multiple sclerosis. Here's a brief overview of some of the potential beneficial roles that short-chain fatty acids, which is one of these beneficial metabolites that are increased through the consumption of prebiotics. And these include various processes related to our brain. So this includes things like including resistance to oxidative stress, improving various pathways like mitochondrial activity, promotes healthy gene expression, and it's also been shown in particular animal models to have neuroprotective, neurocognitive benefits as well. And when researchers provided either a diet high in prebiotic fiber or short-chain fatty acids directly to an animal model of multiple sclerosis, this decreased the severity of symptoms compared to the control conditions. Now let's talk about probiotics. So these are essentially specific strains of bacteria that may influence our gut microbiota composition and its activity. So you can find these probiotic strains in fermented food products, and I'll talk a little bit about this later in the presentation, but also in dietary supplements. Various strains of probiotics have been studied in animal models of multiple sclerosis, where they've shown to reduce inflammatory markers, increase anti-inflammatory markers, as well as reduce symptoms and progression of MS. There are also a very limited number of clinical trials which have been with people with multiple sclerosis that largely reflects the beneficial outcomes seen in the animal studies I just talked about. So various probiotic supplements have been shown to reduce symptoms, clinical symptoms, as well as inflammation, increase antioxidant status. And while these are promising to see, I do have to caution that these are still very preliminary. They're in very small studies, and we need much more research to determine not only the efficacy, but also the long-term safety of these interventions. Now, if you're interested in using probiotics, here's some general tips for selecting some better formulations. So the first is to look for the expiry date. So probiotics degrade over time, particularly if they're not stored correctly. So looking at the expiry date can give you a little bit of a rough indication of how fresh this particular product might be. Look for refrigerated products or those that advertise as shelf stable or enteric coated, as these are more likely to have maintained their potency. We generally don't know which strain is better for any particular condition at the moment. And so selecting whether it's multi-strain or lactobacillus or anything, there aren't any sort of clear guidelines on which strain or combination might be the best. We also don't have a great idea of the most effective dose required, but there is a sort of general rule right now, which is to aim for formulations that list more than 1 billion colony forming units, or CFU, per capsule. Other considerations to keep in mind is that while probiotic supplements are convenient to take, they're also missing nutrients that I guess real food has in them. So fermented foods like yogurt, you're getting the probiotic strain, but you're also getting the protein, B vitamins, calcium, and these sorts of things with each serve. And finally, high doses can cause GI upsets, things like nausea, diarrhea. So keep that in mind, and best to stick to the recommended dosage on the label. I also wanted to talk about fermented foods, which include foods like yogurt, kefir, kombucha, sauerkraut. There are a whole host of different fermented foods on the market right now. And these not only contain probiotics, but depending on the type of fermented food, they also include prebiotic fibers and compounds as well. But what I think is really interesting about fermented foods is that they also contain some of the metabolites of this fermentation process. And these themselves might have their own unique properties that we're only just beginning to understand. And so while there is currently fairly limited amount of research that has investigated the use of fermented foods in multiple sclerosis, I think this really represents a potentially great way to modulate the gut microbiome through our diet. If you're interested in eating more fermented foods, here are a few tips. So the first is to aim for products that are low in sugar. So yogurt in particular has a wide range of products on the market that sometimes can be very high in sugar. So aiming for products that have roughly 5 to 10 grams per 100 grams is a decent rule of thumb. It's nothing prescriptive, but just a decent rule of thumb to aim for. Look for products that actually state the strain and dose of the probiotic strains on their label, because this can give some greater confidence that the product has a viable probiotic properties within the product. Not all fermented foods are FODMAP friendly, so things like sauerkraut and kimchi are some that come to mind. So consider that if you have IBS or intolerances or anything relevant to that. Also consider making them yourself. So there are a whole host of online resources and recipes for making all sorts of fermented foods, which I think just makes it a bit more enjoyable and much less expensive compared to purchasing the product. Finally, some general dietary advice for increasing food groups that appear to be beneficial to our gut microbiota composition, as well as our general health. So the first is to try and include vegetables at each meal. So generally we tend to get the bulk of our vegetable intake at dinner time. And this makes it harder to meet our recommended intake for prebiotic fibers, as well as a range of other beneficial compounds for our gut microbiome. So spreading it across the day can help with that. Selecting fruits, veggies, nuts as snacks can also help boost our intake. And to eat a range of different colored fruits and vegetables, or as it's sometimes been referred to as eat the rainbow, because this ensures that you're getting a range of different polyphenol compounds, which have a whole host of potentially healthy properties, including prebiotic properties. Aim to include more beans and lentils in your diet. Beans are a great way to boost our prebiotic fiber intake, our polyphenol intake, and they're also cheap. Eating oily fish, consuming extra virgin olive oil, these are also really great ways to improve our overall health, but also have been shown to beneficially modulate our gut microbiome. And finally, reducing one's intake of discretionary processed foods. So there is a growing number of studies showing that not only do high fat, high sugar, high energy foods, these tend to disrupt our gut microbiome, but there are also certain additives and ingredients that you only really find in processed foods that also appear to disrupt our gut microbiome. So essentially, while you should still enjoy meals with your friends and at parties and when you're eating out, but you should also be looking for ways to reduce one's intake throughout the week. This is likely to be good for one's health. So in summary, I think the results of what we currently know about how our gut microbiome is related to our brain, as well as multiple sclerosis, these are really exciting developments, but they are also very preliminary. I think at the moment, our best advice is really that general healthy eating advice applies. So sticking to general dietary principles around consuming a large range and amount of various plant-based foods, I think is still our best bet for improving our overall health, but also our gut microbiome. Prebiotic and probiotic supplements, these may be beneficial. There are certainly some developing and promising studies that are showing as such, but much more evidence is needed. And I think the really exciting thing is that really new knowledge is coming out every day. This is a really rapidly developing area. So I hope that next time we present, I have a whole host of more studies and research that I can present to you. If you're interested in following along with what we do, or you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to contact me on my email address, as well as feel free to follow myself or our Food and Mood Center on Twitter. Once again, it was an absolute pleasure to be able to present to you today. I hope you found it useful. And once again, thank you for having me.
So that brings us to the end of our session tonight. Thank you very much for attending. We hope you've enjoyed this year's webinar series. We'll also be sending a brief survey to all registrants for feedback and for suggestions for topics for further MS research webinars. I just remind you that while these webinars are free to join, they do involve some cost to the Trust in putting together, and so donations will be gratefully accepted, and you can support the work of the Research Trust by going on our website and clicking on the donation button. But thank you very much. Remind you that if there are questions, particularly in relation to Dr. Marx's presentation, would you send those to info@msresearch.org.nz, and we will arrange for Dr. Marx to respond to them. So thank you and good evening.